So we're starting the flocking simulation, steps 33. So previously we're exploring the code in a simple model, and this one has a bit more complex code. So let's click Setup and Go to see what the simulation is all about. And this attempts to mimic the flocking of birds. So the resulting motion also resembles the flocking of fish, but the flocks that appear in this model are not created or led in any specific way by any special leader birds. Instead, every single bird is following exactly the same set of rules from which flocks emerge. So we're supposed to think about and consider the bias introduced in this model. First of all, like, what about the age and the fitness of the birds? Is that considered here? Wind, is wind built into this model? Changes in altitude, like there's lots of ways that these omitted real world variables are introducing bias just by omitting the variables. So this is a bias simulation because not all variables are even considered. So let's go ahead and stop the simulation on step 35. We're starting step 35. Go into the code and find the command that creates all the turtles. All right, so we are going to skip step 35 and 36 if we are in the web interface. If you are using the software, go for it. But for the web interface, this doesn't function well for us. So going on to step 37, so back in the code, we're going to change the color of our turtles to anything you want. That's one of the options that we had earlier. Recompile. And set up Go to test. So they also want us to consider why not to use not to use random colors as each turtle is created. And we're supposed to think about what this model's communicating. And we're building this model to represent the flocking of a species. So your visuals matter. And if you created a bunch of random colors and each turtle was a very different color, it would suggest that these were very different birds. And that's not what we're trying to communicate or trying to model. We're trying to model the flocking of a within a species. So bias can be introduced unintentionally with your variables as well. So be thoughtful in what you're choosing. Step 38 also, shapes. Shapes matter. So to see the standard shapes in NetLogo, if you're in the software, go ahead and follow the directions. For those of us that aren't in the software, we get to choose between what might be available shapes from the documentation. So I looked up the chapter on the shapes editor, and some of, but not all of these shapes are possible for us. So I'm going to try the fish shape. So I had to read the documentation about how to set a shape. So when the turtles are created in that little block of code, I'm going to set the shape of each turtle to fish. So set shape fish, recompile. Says nothing named fish has been defined. Let me check. Oops, sorry. Fish. No, fish was an option. Let me check my documentation for setting shapes. Creating and editing turtle shapes. Shapes library. Do a search set shape. Okay. Oh, I have to put it in quotes. Okay. Set shape, and the shape needs to be a string. So I'm going to recompile and set up. Go. All right. Yay. So now I've set the shapes, and again, think of how this might introduce bias. Some of you may have noticed cow was an option. Again, you have to be thoughtful in your choices. Go ahead and experiment for fun, but then be thoughtful in the actual choices that you make. So check if your code's correct, test it, and again, save your model in a format that you're able to submit by clicking HTML and then adding your name.